Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Let's go ahead and take our seats. We've got a lot to get through this afternoon, and I only have 3 hours for this talk, so let's get started. I want to talk about competition and what competition means in a market economy. How should we understand? Why is it important to have competition? What does it mean for an economy to be competitive? You know, what you typically get in a standard economics course or in most discussions of markets among mainstream economists is the idea that, well, competition is a good thing. We want our system to be competitive, but somehow that isn't going to happen on its own, right? There's some kind of a tendency for industries and economies to become monopolized or dominated by large monopolists unless we, where we typically means state regulators and judges and so forth, play some sort of active role in making it competitive and preventing the economy from being monopolized. I mean, you see this all the time, going back at least 150 years or more to the progressive movement of the late 19th century. You can read about that in Murray Rothbard's book on the progressive era that was just published within the last couple of years here by the Institute. Di Lorenzo's written about the origins of antitrust in the 19th century. And we know that in fact, these were not movements led by the people like most so-called populist or progressive movements. They were led by large, powerful special interests who were trying to develop, for example, antitrust laws that would be beneficial to themselves rather than to, the market. In the 20th century, as the neoclassical paradigm became dominant in Western economics, you had within industrial organization and antitrust theory, the dominance of the so-called structure, conduct, performance paradigm, basically the Econ 101, monopoly diagram, arguing that, there's a natural tendency for industries to become monopolized, and you need vigorous antitrust enforcement to make sure that we preserve some balance between competition and maybe some benefits that might accrue from monopoly. Actually for a while in the, 1980s and 1990s, the structure, conduct, performance paradigm was kind of in retreat. There were, like the Chicago School, for example, launched some very powerful critiques of the structure, conduct, performance paradigm in the 1960s and 70s, and those seem to have taken hold in the 80s and 90s in terms of public policy. Now there's been a switch backwards, and now we're seeing sort of a move towards a more aggressive antitrust stance again, at least a lot of calls for that, especially in regard to everybody's favorite whipping horse, right? The tech industry, big tech. So big tech, social media giants, Microsoft, Apple, Google, Amazon, and so forth are under fire. Maybe not Apple so much, but under fire, both from, progressives like Elizabeth Warren, and on the right, you have social conservatives like Josh Hawley, the junior senator from Missouri, who's sort of both of whom are sort of at the forefront of anti-big tech crusades. I'll talk a little bit more about that also on Friday during a lecture that I'm giving on data management and privacy regulation and so forth. So first of all, let's just remind ourselves what we mean by competition in ordinary language. Right, a competition is, an event, a contest, several people competing against each other for some kind of a prize, like at school or sports. For example, I have a picture here of an epic chess competition between Tom Woods and Walter Block from a few years ago here at Mises U. And it's interesting seeing, two old bald guys going at it over the chessboard with a crowd admiring them. I don't remember the outcome. Tom Woods assures me that he wiped the board with Walter Block, but Walter Block said it went the other way. We also use the word, a word like competitive as an adjective to describe like a particularly intense competition. So, I'm not that skilled a chess player, so both Tom and Walter would easily crush me, but the battle between the two of them was pretty evenly matched. And so we might say, boy, that was a really competitive match between Walter and Tom. In the common law, or sort of in the natural law, to build upon the judge's talk from last night, competition and monopoly had a very different meaning from the one they have in mainstream economics today. Right? Monopoly was understood as a restriction on competition awarded by the state. Right? So think of, some of the first large multinational companies, the Dutch East India Company, for example, that had ships going to Indonesia and bringing back spices and so forth to Europe in the late medieval period. I mean, when we say the Dutch East India Company was a monopoly, we don't mean, they had a very large market share. We're not talking about the Herfindahl Index being above some certain number. Right? What we mean is they had a legal grant from the Dutch royal family to trade with the East Indies, and no one else could legally do this. It was against the laws, against the royal charter, for any other merchant to engage in trade with those islands. Only the Dutch East India Company was allowed to do so. So a monopoly was understood as a government grant of special privilege that outlaws competition by other firms. Okay. In conventional economics, monopoly has come to mean something else, right? Large market share, whatever. You might remember to your undergrad econ class, maybe you're taking one now, the notions from neoclassical economics of perfect and imperfect competition, right? So there's this kind of, what Mises would call an imaginary construct of a perfectly competitive industry or a perfectly competitive market, which has certain attributes and certain desirable properties. And if we see a market in the real world having characteristics that differ from this perfectly competitive imaginary construct, then that's some inefficiency or loss of well-being that has to be remedied somehow. Usually the main criterion for perfect competition is the ability of firms to charge prices that are greater than marginal cost. So if a firm can charge prices above costs, then it is said to have some monopoly power or monopoly pricing power. The Austrian School has a very different approach, or actually there are several approaches to monopoly within the Austrian School, which I'll talk about in just a moment. Just to remind you, most of you have seen a diagram like this, right? This is what you get in an undergrad textbook. You've got, this is supposedly a firm producing some commodity, and this is one small firm in a sea of many, many similar firms, right? Each firm is just alike, each firm's product is identical to every other firm's product. So no firm has the ability to attract customers to its product over a rival's product based on some features or something, because all the products are assumed to be the same. So the model describes each individual seller as facing a perfectly elastic or horizontal demand curve. Right, I'm a little wheat farmer in Iowa, whatever, I'm selling wheat. The market price of wheat is so many dollars per bushel, and I can sell as many bushels as I want at that price without affecting it. Right, if I dump a whole bunch of extra wheat on the market, I'm so small relative to the total industry, that doesn't drive the price down. And if I, withhold my wheat from the market for some reason, that doesn't make the price go up because I'm a tiny, tiny player in the market. So I take my demand and marginal revenue as given, and I maximize profit by choosing the quantity where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. And the idea is that, gosh, this is really neat. I mean, you get sort of short-run allocative efficiency. Prices are equal to marginal costs. In the long run, you get entry and exit of firms that drives economic profits to zero. You get this kind of intertemporal allocative efficiency, and wow, this is so good. This is the kind of world we want to live in. But alas, right, reality bites back and instead gives us firms that sell different products. Right, an iPhone and a Samsung Galaxy are very similar, but they're not identical. And a McDonald's hamburger and a Burger King burger are similar, but not quite the same. So in reality, products are not perfect substitutes, and therefore sellers have some degree of monopoly power, according to the conventional analysis. So rather than facing a perfectly elastic demand curve for the product, a firm with monopoly power faces a downward sloping demand curve for the product. And maybe you've done the algebra, the geometry on this before. You get a downward sloping marginal revenue curve that is below and more steeply sloped than the demand curve. And so when the firm maximizes profits by setting marginal revenue equal to marginal cost, the quantity produced is actually smaller than the quantity that would have obtained under conditions of perfect competition. The firm sort of withholds some output from the market in order to drive up the price and climb up that marginal revenue curve and get a higher level of profit than would otherwise have obtained. Oh, and by the way, this is not only bad for consumers. It's not just that consumers lose some of their utility that goes to the firm in the form of profits, but there's also some extra inefficiency in the form of the so-called deadweight loss triangle, which represents, lost gains to the consumers that are not captured by the seller. The point is, this is bad, right, compared to the previous diagram. So if the world looks like this, we've got to do something to make it more like that other world in which firms have perfectly elastic demand curves. I mean, it's kind of an interesting mental exercise, right? It's kind of a little game that you could play. You can look at the math and you can poke around with it. What does it really tell us about competition or its absence in actual markets composed of real people engaged in purposeful human action and so forth? I mean, the short answer is not much. There are a lot of, even within the neoclassical paradigm, there are a number of critiques of this model, which we don't have time to get into. But I'll just share with you some of the critiques that have been levied by Austrians. Rothbard, for example, took pains to point out that this notion of the perfectly elastic demand curve cannot obtain in a world of actual, purposeful human actors, right? Every seller, in fact, contributes some discrete quantity, not an infinitesimally small quantity to the output of the industry. And so every seller's actions will have some impact on price. Remember those diagrams I showed you before? Again, they're mathematical abstractions. When your professor tells you, well, under perfect competition, firms are really small, your professor doesn't mean that, well, they only have like 10 employees. Like really small means like literally of size 0. I mean, it's sort of a calculus-based argument. In other words, the claim is as the number of firms approaches infinity, i.e. as the size of each firm approaches 0, the profits obtained by the individual firm in the long run approach 0 and price approaches marginal cost and so forth. So if we're in that diagram I showed you of the perfectly competitive market, the firms literally have size 0. I mean, there are a lot of small businesses around, but I've never seen one that had size 0, had 0 labor and 0 capital, right? So, I mean, that can't literally be true. So no matter how small a firm is, it's bigger than size 0. The firm contributes some output to the market and so forth. In the world of purposeful human action, we're not dealing with infinitesimally small units, right? Remember Karl Menger's analysis of economic goods, and Menger's analysis of marginal utility, of course, refers to actors choosing discrete quantities of actual goods in the real world, not like, oh, in the limit, in a calculus sense, the change in utility approaches 0, okay? There's another point too. If you try to come up with sort of a welfare analysis of, sort of anti-monopoly policy. So suppose the government says, well, we're going to make it illegal for a firm to sell less output than it could hypothetically have sold if the market were more competitive. Yeah, essentially we're compelling the firm or an individual to produce more, okay? Well, then you're violating the sort of property rights or rights to life and so forth of the person who's being forced to bring more units to market than otherwise would be the case. You often see this kind of example used with like celebrities, to take, for example, my doppelganger, George Clooney. I don't know how many movies per year George Clooney makes. I mean, in the old days, in the golden age of Hollywood, 1920s, 30s, 40s, actors worked every day and they made, dozens of movies per year. Now, a big star like George Clooney might be in 1 or 2 movies per year. And, people want to see them, or at least they did when they could go to the movies. I guess they want to stream them now. And so somebody makes money off of that. You could argue that, well, there's only one George Clooney, so he has a monopoly on George Clooney acting, right? I mean, the other actors are kind of similar, but they're not perfect substitutes. So, I mean, he should be compelled, if you follow the sort of standard logic, to produce as many, to act in as many movies per year as is humanly possible. I mean, he should be acting 16 hours a day. He gets to sleep and have bathroom breaks, but he should continually be acting. Otherwise, he is withholding some of his labor from the market and making the price of George Clooney's labor artificially high. I imagine it's pretty darn high, right? But if he acted every single minute of every day, his earnings would probably go way down. Right, so why is he allowed to withhold labor from the market to jack up the price? I mean, if you think, well, that's silly, of course, George Clooney should not be compelled to act against his will to provide more units of George Clooney labor to the market than he desires. You know, well, why should Jeff Bezos be required to provide more Amazon stuff to the market, to have more transactions or provide more units of Amazon Web Services or whatever, right? Any alleged monopolist is producing less than what the regulator thinks should be produced. Okay, so if you're going to compel people to produce more, then we should all be compelled to you know, do whatever we're told to do all the time and not have any control over our own labor. Another point, too, that's a little bit more subtle is, you know, this whole idea about the demand curve. They say, well, if the demand curve for a product is very inelastic, that gives the seller more ability to raise price over cost. Maybe you did an example in your class at school, you know, comparing like, you know, cigarettes and candy bars or something and looking at how the elasticity of demand affects prices and quantities in those markets. I mean, elasticity of demand is not sort of given by nature. The shape of the demand curve, the properties of the demand curve, the elasticity of the demand curve reflects consumer preferences. Right, and if demand is inelastic, that means that people are not willing to reduce their consumption very much in the face of an increasing price. Well, okay, they could have chosen something different. I mean, elasticity reflects consumer choice, so it's not obvious why, you know, well-being is somehow better in a world where firms act as if they're facing perfectly elastic demand curves as opposed to demand curves that are not perfectly elastic or maybe super inelastic, right? That's totally up to consumers. It's not a technological concept. Elasticity is an economic concept that reflects human choice. In his opening talk on Sunday night, Joe Salerno briefly mentioned a difference of opinion between Mises and Rothbard on monopoly. I'll just say a little bit more about that here. Mises rejected the standard approach to monopoly that I've sort of briefly outlined here. But Mises did articulate a theory of monopoly price that does come from the Austrian tradition of Menger and Baumbawerk and Wieser and others, but which is not, I think, is not as sort of, has sort of fallen out of favor within the Austrian tradition today. And Mises' theory was not one about the existence of monopoly as a situation or a firm, not identifying firms as monopolists, but rather Mises argued that under certain conditions, the prices that obtain in certain kinds of markets are different than the prices that would have obtained in other kinds of conditions. So Mises had a theory of monopoly prices. Mises thought you could distinguish praxeologically competitive prices from monopoly prices. And Mises argued that, well, if you have these special conditions, you have a single seller of a unique good, a good for which consumers perceive there to be no substitutes. Again, this consumer perception, so Mises didn't think this was some kind of a market failure. He just sort of noted it in doing his analysis, that if you have a unique good and a single seller or a cartel of sellers, and the demand for the product is inelastic above the competitive price, the price that would have obtained if there were lots of sellers of this same good, then the price is going to be higher than it otherwise would have been. Okay, Mises thought logically you could theorize about what a monopoly price would be and what the competitive price would be. And he said, well, in practice, the existence of monopoly prices does violate consumer sovereignty in the sense that consumers would have been willing to pay for additional units had they been released to the market. Okay, like I say, of course, you have to add to that the fact that consumers willingness to substitute is also a matter of consumer preference and choice, right? But Mises thought, these conditions, in practice, these conditions will hardly ever obtain. And so there's no sort of public policy response needed. Mises just thought it was sort of an interesting theoretical puzzle, an interesting situation to think about, not really relevant for policy. So Rothbard actually embraces Mises' approach to monopoly pricing, but disagrees with some of the steps in Mises' analysis. Rothbard argued, as I sort of hinted before, that actually all sellers face a downward sloping demand curve, okay? Rothbard says, well, given that we don't really know what the competitive price would have been if conditions had been different, we really can't distinguish the price that obtains on the market from a price that would have obtained on the market if you'd had more sellers or a different elasticity of demand. All we observe is actual prices that occur in market exchange, right? We don't observe the imaginary construct of the competitive price. We only observe the actual price. And so even theoretically, we can't really distinguish monopoly prices from competitive prices. In other words, all firms try to maximize their revenues, right? They try to maximize their net income, their profit, given their beliefs about demand, as we discussed yesterday. Entrepreneurs are buying factors of production, combining them into goods and services, offering those for sale on the market based on their beliefs about demand and so forth. And this idea that, well, it's only if the demand curve is inelastic above a certain point can monopoly occur. Rothbard points out, all firms price in the elastic range of the demand curve. Why? Because if they were currently pricing in the inelastic range of the demand curve, they would do what with the price? They would raise it, because if the demand curve's inelastic, when you raise the price, your total revenue goes up, right? And you're producing less, so your total costs presumably go down, so your profit would increase. All firms, no matter what the market conditions, are always going to be pricing in the inelastic part of the demand curve. So above the actual price, the demand's going to be inelastic no matter what. So all prices, this characterizes all prices, not just a special set of prices, okay? Rothbard argued instead for a return to the common law or natural law notion of monopoly as an exclusive government grant. Rothbard said we should reserve the term monopoly for cases like the U.S. Postal Service or the East India Company or a public utility in many, many cities and towns across the world. There's only one company that provides water. In the U.S., as you may know, most of these, or many water, electric, waste disposal services are not provided by a government agency. They're provided by private firms that have shareholders and are incorporated and so forth, but firms that have been given an exclusive grant by the city. You're the only one that can lay electric wires. You're the only one that can put pipes in the ground and send water to people's houses and so forth. Sometimes it's not quite that obvious. A patent is a monopoly. It's a monopoly grant, a grant of monopoly privilege, temporary, 17 years or whatever. So as long as I hold the patent, no one else can legally produce the same good or service as the one on which I have the patent. Some other kind of exclusive grant or a charter, trading privileges, licensing, and so forth. It's sort of a kind of monopoly. Occupational licensing has the same kind of monopoly effect. To cut hair, you've got to have a barber's license. It's illegal to cut hair without a barber's license in most places. So that restricts the quantity of people who can cut hair, and it increases the profits of those who have the license. Okay, I think occupational licensing is terrible, except in higher education, where we need the PhD granting process to prevent students from getting low-quality education. It's for your protection. It's nothing to do with my wages. Even trade policy, tariffs and quotas can have a monopolizing effect in this sense, right? So what we mean by monopoly in the Rothbardian system is some government restriction on the ability of people to compete, right? If the city of Auburn said Tom Woods may not play chess, and then Walter Block is the champion, well, then Walter Block earned his championship through through monopoly privilege. we'd say Walter has some monopoly power on the chessboard. That's pretty much the only way he could win, isn't it? So I want to return to something I mentioned earlier, just sort of turning to what's going on in the world today. You know, this sort of naive idea that, well, in the absence of strong antitrust policy and regulation, markets will tend toward monopoly in the neoclassical sense. Therefore, we need the antitrust laws and we need government to regulate utilities and so forth to try to make them more competitive, keep their prices down. You know, that was sort of the dominant paradigm in the mid-20th century. And then it was challenged from a number of dimensions. Oliver Williamson's transaction cost approach criticized the structure, conduct, performance view, sort of a vertical relations. I mentioned that just because Williamson, Nobel Prize winner, passed away a few months ago. A lot of people are revisiting his work. The Chicago School, as I mentioned, in the 60s and 70s and 80s, published a number of critiques of the structure, conduct, performance paradigm. In the 90s and 2000s, industrial organization economics became dominated by game theory as the sort of standard analytical tool, and that sort of threw into question some of the Chicago School's contributions, and people sometimes refer to post-Chicago antitrust analysis, referring to the game theoretic industrial organization modeling. And that was kind of the dominant thing, you know, when I was trained. But in the last 3 or 4 years, we've seen a revival of something that to me is much closer to the old structure, conduct, performance paradigm. Its critics call it hipster antitrust. Its adherents call it something like neo-Brandeisian, named after Justice Brandeis, who was a strong proponent of strong antitrust enforcement during the Progressive era. Antitrust, I don't know, activist, I guess, named Lena Khan is kind of at the forefront of the hipster movement. She's a law student who wrote an article that criticized big tech companies and said, well, even though they don't look like monopolists on the seller side, you know, because most of their stuff's free. All the Google services you get are free. You don't pay for those. You use Twitter and Facebook and so forth, Instagram, those are all free. So it doesn't really, we can't really say they're charging monopoly prices and earning monopoly profits to consumers. Maybe you could say that for Apple, but not for the platforms. Well, they must be monopolists in some other way. It has something to do with on the labor side or how they squeeze their input providers or whatever. So she's kind of one of the stars of the hipster movement. Interestingly, one of the areas in which we've seen a revival of interest in the traditional monopoly theory and the traditional antitrust analysis is in the study of minimum wages. Okay, so Mark Thornton has a lecture later in the week on labor markets and minimum wage laws, which I'm sure you'll be interested in if you're interested in this. But it's worth mentioning now as an application or extension of Austrian monopoly theory. Okay, in the last I don't know, decade or so, we've seen a lot of policy attention on minimum wages. Right, you get the Fight for 15 movement. I guess that started in Seattle and other places, now spread to other cities. We observe in many entry-level employment sectors a substitution away from labor towards automated, towards automation. Right, I mean, at a higher minimum wage, more and more fast food joints are going to switch to kiosks because they're cheaper than hiring workers at $15 an hour. I don't remember who I saw 2 or 3 days ago on social media wanting a, was it $50 minimum wage, $50 per hour minimum wage would solve some progressive activist, how that would solve all our problems. I don't know what people like, Sanders and AOC want the minimum wage to be. I'm sure it's much higher than 15. Probably if you've taken an undergrad econ course, you've done an analysis of the minimum wage already. And the way we typically do it, or at least the way we used to do it, was using a, sort of simple model of the labor market with supply and demand curves. Okay, with an upward sloping supply curve and a downward sloping demand curve, and you've got the quantity of labor on the horizontal axis, and you've got the rental price of labor, the wage on the vertical axis. And how many of you have seen this kind of a model before? Right, so you say, well, in a free market for labor, the equilibrium wage would be, whatever that is, where the supply and demand curves intersect. If the government passes a minimum wage law where the minimum wage is above the market clearing wage, right, that means that, at that higher wage, the quantity supplied is going to be greater than the quantity demanded. So you've got this extra, surplus of labor on the market. More people want to work at that higher minimum wage than there are jobs available to them, because employers are less willing to offer jobs at a higher mandated minimum wage, so you get unemployment. Right? So, the standard economist critique of minimum wage laws is to say, yeah, but maybe it's good for those workers who are able to keep their jobs and remain employed, but it's going to throw a lot of people out of work, and so it doesn't provide a net benefit on the labor market. Okay, fine. This seems pretty it's hard to argue against this. I've seen people like even Paul Krugman, back before he turned evil, would say that things like, well, this analysis is of course correct, but I personally prefer to have fewer people working at a higher wage than more people working at a lower wage. It's just a subjective preference on the part of the policy analyst. That's why I want a higher minimum wage. But nobody thought that it was sort of good for the labor market in general. Okay, this analysis, and maybe you use this when you argue with your friends about minimum wage laws, this analysis is obsolete now. Okay, rather, the sort of what's becoming more the mainstream analysis is to say, no, this doesn't work, because this model assumes that the market for labor is competitive. What if it's not competitive? What if, rather than monopoly power in the labor market, we need to worry about monopsony power? Okay, so remember, monopsony is like the equivalent of monopoly, but on the buyer side rather than the seller side. Okay, so if a monopolist is a single buyer selling a unique good or service, if a monopolist is a single seller selling a unique good or service, and therefore able to charge prices higher than competitive prices, a monopsonist is a buyer, a large, powerful buyer, who is able to influence the price on the market to push it below what it would be in a competitive buying situation. Okay, so just as monopoly prices are supposed to be above the competitive prices, monopsony prices are, a monopsony wage would be a wage that's below the wage that would obtain if the labor market were competitive. Okay, so if employers have monopsony power, then the wages that obtain in an unregulated labor market are lower than they would be in a competitive labor market. Okay, and if it's not possible to use antitrust to sort of break up these big firms and take away their buying power, the next best alternative is to regulate the wage, to push the wage up to get it closer to what we think the wage would have been in the absence of monopsony. Okay, that's the currently fashionable argument in policy circles for minimum wages. Okay, you can find a handy Vox explainer if you want this theory Vox-plained to you, and you can find a lot of good stuff on this. Probably I should have mentioned earlier when we were talking about monopoly, what's the remedy for monopoly power in the mainstream analysis? Well, I mean, one remedy would be leave things the way they are, leave the big firms in place, but just regulate the prices they can charge, right? Don't let a monopolist charge high prices. Force them to charge lower prices through some kind of price regulation, right? Or you could just sort of break them up, use antitrust to split the big firm into lots of little firms. I mean, hopefully not little firms of size 0. I'm not sure what you'd use for that, like an atom bomb or something. But, in this case, if it's not feasible to break up the firms to take away their monopsony power, then you just use price regulation, thinking of the wage as a price, to force the wage to be higher than it otherwise would be and closer to its sort of competitive level. It won't surprise you, probably, to hear that I think there's some problems with this analysis. Okay, there's some problems with the monopsony argument. I mean, first, we can talk about kind of theoretical problems along the same lines as Rothbard's critique of Mises' argument for monopoly pricing in output markets. okay? So just as Rothbard argued that, all demand curves facing sellers are at least somewhat inelastic, downward sloping, we can also point out that all supply curves for laborers on the market are at least somewhat upward sloping. Okay, there's no such thing as a perfectly competitive labor market where the supply curve for labor is perfectly elastic, right? Firms can go out and hire as many workers as they want at the given wage without affecting that wage. I mean, that world doesn't exist either because labor is not perfectly homogeneous, right? So every worker can affect the supply of labor at least a little bit by choosing to work or not to work, or to work more hours or fewer hours. Because there's really no way to distinguish a competitive input price, in this case a competitive wage, from a monopsony input price, in this case a monopsony wage. So this is perfectly analogous to Rothbard's argument about output prices, okay? So, if you think the logic through, in the absence of legal restrictions, suppose it's the case that some firms are paying wages that are below the wages that would obtain under competitive conditions. The equilibrium or market clearing wage is $10 an hour, but some firms, just because they can, because they're big and powerful and mean, right, they only pay $8 an hour for their workers. Well, I mean, that would provide an incentive for another firm to jump into the market, an existing firm or a new firm, and offer, $8? No, offer $8.50 and bid some workers away from the firm that was charging prices that were too low. And well, that would give an incentive for yet another firm to jump in and so forth. Remember when we were talking yesterday about entrepreneurship and profit, right? Entrepreneurs are competing against each other for factors of production. And they would like to pay as little as they can for factors, for inputs. They would like to pay a price that's way below the discounted marginal revenue product. If they can, good for them. That gives them some extra profit to put in their pocket, right? But if we assume that there are lots of other entrepreneurs also trying to do the same thing, then it's unlikely that you'll be able to get a unit of the factor at a price that's much less than the discounted marginal revenue product. Now, you wouldn't pay more, but if there's a lot of firms competing, you're probably going to pay pretty close to that discounted marginal revenue product. Well, this is an application of that exact same principle, where the input being provided is labor, right? And so the entrepreneur is hiring units of labor services and is probably not going to be able to pay a lot less than the discounted marginal revenue product of labor. Otherwise, other entrepreneurs will jump in and take advantage of that and help to drive that price up towards its DMRP, okay? And let's be practical here. I mean, is the monopsony argument really a good one for minimum wage laws? I mean, let's just think about it on a practical basis. What do we know about the institutions of the labor market in most times and places, especially at kind of the entry level, for entry-level wages? It's really hard to imagine a single buyer or a buyer's cartel for something like unskilled labor. I mean, how many of you worked, in food service, as we euphemistically call it, when you were in high school? You worked at McDonald's or Burger King or something. A lot of people work in fast food. I mean, it's not super skilled labor. Anybody can learn how to do it. And, even if you're from a small town, I mean, look at Auburn, Opelika. It's not a huge city. It's not New York City. It's not teeny tiny, but it's kind of a small city. I mean, how many fast food restaurants are there just between here and the hotel? How many fast food restaurants do you pass by? Is it really conceivable that either they would all somehow form a cartel, hey, let's all agree, nobody pay more than $3 per hour I mean, it doesn't make sense. In fact, in today and for certainly probably for the last decade, I mean, there are very few cities and towns or MSAs where the prevailing wage for fast food workers is not quite a bit more than the minimum wage. I mean, even in Auburn, McDonald's is paying more than the state of Alabama legal minimum wage for fast food workers because that's how you get them. Otherwise, you can't hire enough. Why? Because lots of other people want to hire them too. Okay, so the legal minimum wage, I mean, the equilibrium wage in the absence of minimum wage laws would probably be much higher than the minimum wage anyway. So in most U.S. cities and towns, I don't know about the entire world, but in the U.S., mostly minimum wage laws, it's kind of virtue signaling, right? I mean, politicians can say, I support minimum wages, but even without those laws, the wages would be higher than what the minimum wage is anyway. The minimum wages are typically not binding, in other words. Also keep in mind that, of all the different factors of production that go into making a McDonald's hamburger, you've got the meat and the bread and the machinery and the investment capital that's needed to set up the restaurant and the managerial expertise and all the specialized tools and so forth. The input that is the most mobile and flexible and most easily substitutable is, no offense, and me, right? Whoever's working in the McDonald's, right? That labor is highly mobile, right? If one firm were paying, way below what other firms pay, you're not going to stay and work there. You can go work for another place. So it just really, you might imagine some markets where monopsony arguments might be plausible, right? There's a highly specialized kind of labor. I don't know, say, in sports or something. If you're a professional basketball player and, you're not getting a good contract offer in the NBA, you really, you could go play professional basketball in China or something, but that's probably not a close substitute for playing in the NBA. So maybe you earn less than you would if there were 6 different professional basketball leagues, because you don't have many other options for how to utilize your talents. It's a very specialized kind of labor. Is that really the case for people who earn the minimum wage jobs? No, labor is a highly non-specific and highly mobile factor. So it really just isn't plausible. I think this is just sort of a fancy way of justifying, again, the virtue signaling. If you say you advocate minimum wages, it makes it sound like you're for the little guy, you don't want workers to get ripped off and all that kind of thing. But I don't think this is a very good argument for it. Okay, so just to summarize, the most sensible way to think about competition is not as this kind of imaginary construct with an infinite number of infinitesimally small firms and so forth. But rather we should think about competition as a process of rivalry among entrepreneurs and also factor owners, including laborers and so forth, who are free to compete as they see fit within some kind of legal framework, within a framework that establishes property rights and enforces contracts and so forth. Right, so as long as people are not legally prevented from trying out a particular venture or competing, trying to get hired in a particular job, then those markets are competitive. That's really the only meaningful sense of the terms competition and monopoly. It doesn't matter if you've got just a few firms or a lot of firms. It doesn't matter if the firms are large or if the firms are small. It doesn't matter if firms are currently earning high profits or earning losses. Right? Remember, in the neoclassical model of perfect competition, in this sort of long-run equilibrium, all firms are earning zero economic profit. So you often see these studies, we go out and try to estimate the profit margin in automobile manufacturing or whatever, and we find that it's greater than zero. Therefore, that market is not competitive. Come on. It's also, I think I mentioned this yesterday too, all of the stylized anecdotal examples. Well, what about Google? No one will ever be able to overthrow Google, even though it doesn't have a state license. I can legally create a search engine, but it's not likely that many people are going to use it. But Google has not been around for 200 years, right? Google was introduced when other search engines, Yahoo and one called Alta Vista, that's not around anymore, dominated that market. I sometimes show my students an article that was published, I think it's 11 years ago now, titled, in one of the tech magazines, titled, "Will MySpace Ever Lose Its Monopoly?" As long as there is no legal prohibition on other people competing with you, your market position is not safe, no matter how large of the share of the market you might currently have, okay? And obviously, we want a system that encourages entry and exit. Right? If I'm outcompeted by somebody, we don't want government subsidies that keep my firm alive, that prevent me from laying off workers and so forth. We can talk about coronavirus stimulus later if you want, this afternoon in the Q&A. But we want a system that encourages innovation and experimentation and so forth. And the typical kinds of legal protections, anti-monopoly law and competition policy and so forth, typically have the exact opposite effect. Okay, government attempts to limit monopoly power as conventionally defined cannot make society better off, can't make workers better off, can't make consumers better off. I mean, the best government policy towards competition or the best government policy towards monopoly is don't create any. Okay, let people compete in the market and we will get all the benefits of competition. Thank you.
So if I'm a lawmaker who's going to cancel, yeah, I mean, they're always, you've got, Gab and Carla, these other alternatives that are dipping into heels. Just, the guy I found a Gab, he and his wife are also personal jobs. Is that right? Not just their business accounts, but also their personal accounts. I hate to be in that position. But yeah, I'm sure it's true. I went down to raise that for 10 years. You made it when you're the hotspot. The question is, why don't people start using Russian payment processors? It seems to me like, look at transoceanic shipping. Almost all of these big ships are chartered in Nigeria or some offshore jurisdiction by some sort of one of their own heirs or whatever. All of their ships are owned and chartered in these small, weird tax havens, exactly. Maritime law havens. You do that? So why hasn't or the state forget that I don't have returns. I'm not used to like having to turn out.
Every paragraph word of this book is somehow coincidentally or relevant to like random things I've learned over the past 2 months. So much to do with snow crash.
Is that on my channel?
Do we think the snow crash guy was Trump's kid or Nancy Trump's kid? Yeah, just.
Is that on the file?
There are files. It's about computer.
Maybe it's not in here.
I've never written on just Doug Casey got me hold of it.
Oh, okay.
He created the design of the file. I was in the Doug Casey for the whole research.
Snowcraft involved like, a virtual reality thing, and there's a virtual reality drone called Snowcraft. Is what it is.
I will.
Yeah,
I mean, you did be like the.
I would describe it.
No.
Describe it as.
It's an actual on Swiss. I'm telling you what the Death Star was. That's not a moon, it's a space station. Would you mind me told the Death Star? When in doubt, leave it out.
Oh, that's fine.
Not a good calling. You see what they do on Kennedy reason?
That's what counts. It's not about enthusiasm. It's actually about signal.
Yeah.
I like it.
Jack. Oh, you want
Yeah, Christy said we're just going to Photoshop Agnes in. So we don't have to do anything. Can you Photoshop me in Christy?
you say population,
Exactly.
Different like heights of it. And I'm like, I had to always think different choices. And it looks like the same film. Since I know, it kind of barely.
Has it all even changed and completely destroyed?
Yeah.
Packages.
Yeah, because they were like, only we know that Victor is not real.
You thought you'd see that, but it actually happened.
What are we doing on time? 1 minute? All right. Better start on time.
My dad just texted me. I'm 15 minutes ahead of you.
So your wife says was not times.
o'clock. All right, everyone, so it's 2 o'clock, so let's get started. So, my student told me that I should tell you all that I'm on Twitter, at Per Bylund, and you should follow me, and so tells me that I am a good follow.
Yes.
All right? So, it's been endorsed. So in this lecture, what I'll do is talk a little bit about business and how business can make use of Austrian economics. In my other lecture on Thursday, I will get into the impacts of entrepreneurship on the economy. So that will be a little more theory. This will focus more on sort of the practice and how business people, businessmen, entrepreneurs can and often do apply Austrian economic ideas and Austrian economic theories when running and starting businesses. Okay, so I'll start by sort of bringing you gently out of the ivory tower and step by step taking you into the world of Austrians and then into a terrible thing, but the world of practitioners. I mean, we like theory, right, so as Austrians, but theory has value because it can be put into practice, right? So we'll be getting there. But let's start with the theory, okay? So we'll start right here. And what is this? It's a black box, right? This is actually the firm. This is, and you listened to Dr. Klein in the previous lecture talking a little about the firm and competition and monopoly and so forth. Well, this is pretty much how regular mainstream economics sees the firm. It's a black box. What the heck is going on in that black box? Well, who cares? That's their answer, right? So we don't really know, and it's not really economics anyway, so why would we care about it? Well, it's really important if you're a businessman, right? So if you are actually running a business, if you're starting a business, you need to know a little bit about what is going on in your black box, right? So the way they see it is that, well, there are inputs. They get into this black box. It's more like you can think of it as a bag with stuff in it, and you shake it up, and then there's something else coming out, and it's outputs, right? So obviously you have a function of the firm, the business firm in the economy, and it is whatever it lies between inputs and outputs. Something is going on there. Exactly what is going on in this black box? Well, this is what is going on, right? This is very helpful for businessmen. So if you're starting a business, well, y equals AL raised to the power of alpha, K raised to the power of beta. Perfect. All you need to do now is just figure out what is A, right? And then there you go. So another way of putting this then is that K and L, which means capital and labor, homogeneous things, right? So it's just dollar values, goes into the business, and out of the business comes Y, the total value of your production, right? So basically, your business is A, right? If you do the math quickly, that's it. So how helpful is this? Well, not a whole lot, but if you look at it, this is the explanation then about what these things mean. So Y is the total value of your production within the business. L is the labor, K is the capital, as I said. The alpha and beta are just fractions showing the combinations between labor and capital in the business. Of course, you can tweak this so you can maximize your business. Maybe you use 25% capital and 75% labor, whereas the other guy uses 40-60. Right? Maybe that is a better mix and you make more money as profit. This is totally unhelpful. This is, as in Dr. Klein's lecture, in equilibrium, this might make some kind of sense. Well, the world is not in equilibrium, as we know, right? The economy is always in disequilibrium, so there is a way of earning money. There's a way of making profits that is not really shown here in this simple schematic that I made up and the function that I did not make up. Okay, so what is the firm like here in this equilibrium world? Well, simply put, there's no entrepreneur. So no one really started it. There's no management. So no one is really running the show. There's no heterogeneity, except for K and L. That's pretty much it, right? So you can't really, Joseph Schumpeter, as some of you might know, he was sort of a half Austrian. he talked about entrepreneurship as new combinations. Well, the combination is K and L, so the newness is just the fractions, right? There's no organization, which is something that more recent economists have added to the picture, that you can actually have different organizational models and use people in different ways and maybe streamline the processes and things like that. I mean, any manager or strategist in businesses, they work with shaping the organization to cut out waste and increase profits, make people more productive and so forth. Well, that's not really in here. Okay, and there's no differentiation. Like you heard in the previous lecture, now the businesses do exactly the same thing. And of course, they're the size of 0, which doesn't make any sense at all. But this is what the firm looks like in equilibrium, and it's still the basic unit. That's where production happens. How much sense does this make? Well, obviously, this is not very helpful for actual businessmen and businesswomen. So if we then move one step away from this theoretical imaginary world of modern economists, you get into business administration, basically moving from the econ department to the business school, if you will. So what does that look like? Well, very different suddenly. So here we have, well, the entrepreneur is who starts the business, okay? The manager is who runs the firm. So the entrepreneur is sort of important in the beginning, just to get things going, and then, well, then the manager takes over, or maybe the entrepreneur becomes a manager. It's the same person, or something like that, right? Now, the firms try to beat each other. Imagine that. They're trying to get unique, valuable resources. If you just get your hand on this really highly valued resource that is also unique, then you become sort of a monopolist in a sense, and you can make above normal profits, like it's called, okay? So your task is really to figure out which resource is this unique one, make sure that you get it, and then you just sit back basically and swallow the profits. They just fly into your mouths. And then, of course, firms can internally, through organization, develop specific capabilities. So through routines, through specific processes, through playing off of and using people's human capital, their specific skills and expertise, you can develop capabilities that others might not have. It could also be in combination with the valuable resource in the previous point, right? And of course, they're trying to be a little different. Okay, so by being different, you can exercise monopoly power. You can raise the price and thereby earn profit at consumers' expense. Doesn't really sound like a harmonious system, but. Okay, so what does this mean then in the business school when you get into different departments and different foci of what we study? Well, in entrepreneurship, we focus on studying how to start a firm, so very hands-on type of business plans and things like that. We talk about who gets to start a firm, or well, not who gets to, but who actually does start a firm, and why, and when does it happen, and how is it successful, and so forth. Now, in this field, there's really no place for economics at all, because economics can't help with starting firms, because the firms are already there. And Bill Baumol is famous for saying that, well, the economics profession has sort of expunged the entrepreneur from economic theory. It's not there anymore. It's not that interesting, because you can't really maximize or optimize entrepreneurship, because that doesn't make any sense at all. Well, if you move on into strategy departments, they talk about how to position the firm with respect to the other forces. And that's their word, right? So it's really economics flipped upside down. So when economics teaches us exactly how the economy can be efficient by competing away all profits and maximizing output and that sort of thing, strategy just flips this upside down and says, wait a minute, if the economy is efficient, how can I make profits? Well, I can make profits by making the economic system inefficient, right? If I just come out on top, then I can be the one to extract all those profits and outcompete all the other ones, right? So as soon as you get away from efficiency, there is some profit that you can capture. And that's all you need to do. And figure out what that position is, right? So if your competitors are doing this thing over here and this thing over here, well, there seems to be a gap right here. Okay, well, I can take that space, and if I'm the only one doing exactly this, it's an inefficient system, right? Because there are not numerous firms doing the same thing. So I can just take in those profits, right? So the point is to seek sustained competitive advantage. And that's what you do through getting those unique resources. So if I have a unique resource that no one else has, that makes me profitable, then I'm gonna just get those profits, right? Okay, so and in management departments, you look into sort of the direction of people, the structuring of the firm and so forth. That really goes into psychology and leadership and things like that, right? So economics doesn't really have anything to say about this. And listening to Mises, this is not really part of the economic realm anyway, right? Because psychology and stuff like that. And then you have something weird called managerial economics. And it's simply applying economic functions to the firm itself. So basically telling managers that, oh, well, what you need to do is just charge a price that equals marginal cost, and then you're maximizing. Well, that sort of assumes that you have a production function and so forth. This is really difficult because most firms do not actually have a production function. You don't have the math, and you can't really do a partial derivative in order to maximize it either. So it's not very helpful, right? Okay, so where do Austrians stand in all this? Well, we're different in every possible way, you could say, right? So we really stand out as unique, and really as not at all economists in sort of the mainstream sense, right? So first of all, production to us is not the black box, it's entrepreneurial. It's trying to figure out how to produce more value than anybody else has been doing, or create more satisfaction using the resources available, figure out a new way of doing it, a better way of doing it, figure out new ways to do it. All of these things, right? We talk about opportunities as the possibility of satisfying consumers in their future wants, right? So there's a time aspect too, and we'll get back to that. So what we're doing here is looking at not the inefficiency of the system and the equilibrium and things like that, but rather aiming to a future point in time where we can be better than others at satisfying consumers. That's very different too. There's no time in economic models, right? Okay. Economic goods is how we start out. We start talking about what an economic good is, and from there we move on back, right? So that's where entrepreneurs start, thinking about the good itself. What can I produce that is actually of value to people? And then how can I do that while earning a profit? Very different way of thinking about it. And Salerno covered this, the economic good, a little bit yesterday, and he used this quote from Menger. This is from Menger's Principles, right? So an economic good is something that is useful to us, that we have the power to actually use to satisfy our wants, and that we don't have more of than we actually need. Okay, so in Salerno's lecture, he went through the 4 points that you need a human need and so forth, right? But the economic good is where everything starts out. That's the point of it all, right? Okay, so what this means then for the consumer in the market, it's actually a pretty complex picture. So this is my own attempt at sort of illustrating this. But the consumer values, of course, a good for its ability to satisfy a want. That's number one, the core there in the picture. So imagine that you're an entrepreneur and you're producing a widget. And then, is this going to be valuable? Well, the first thing is you need to actually satisfy a want for the consumer. That's one thing, right? Well, that's not really how a consumer makes a decision, because they're not buying anything that could potentially be useful to them. So you have to also be better, offer more value than other goods that satisfy the same want, right? So that's your immediate competition. So maybe there are other widgets out there that can satisfy consumers in exactly the same way. Okay, well, you need to beat them. You need to offer a better deal than they do. Well, that's not enough either, because the consumer has plenty of wants. So even though, say I'm hungry, that's my want, even though someone offers me burgers, someone else offers me pizzas, they're trying to satisfy my same want, but then there's something completely different. Maybe a bicycle that I find really attractive or something like that. That's a completely different want, because I'm not trying to, or I'm not intending to eat the bicycle, right? Well, I have limited purchasing power as a consumer, meaning I will choose what gives me the best return for my purchasing power, regardless of the wants, right? And regardless of the products. I'm choosing between all of these products no matter what. It could be that if I'm really hungry, that I'm just gonna, never mind all this other stuff, I'm just gonna go for food, whatever. But if I'm not super hungry, I might actually go for the bicycle, right? So I still need to consider, and as an entrepreneur, I need to beat those other wants and provide a better deal than that. And of course, the consumer always has the option to just say, nah, and simply go for something else later on, right? So saving for the future, saying that I'm not gonna do anything right now. I'm just gonna buy stuff a week from now or tomorrow instead. So I'm not super hungry, the bicycle is a little expensive, I'm just gonna hold on to my cash and I'll have a huge breakfast tomorrow instead, right? So you're also competing with their time preference in a sense. So when you're offering a good and trying to sell it to someone, you as an entrepreneur or a businessman, you have to provide sufficient value to beat all of those two, three, and four, through your one, right? So you have to offer a really good deal for the consumer or you're screwed. Okay, we also have this time element. We know that production precedes consumption. This seems like a silly statement. This seems like something that's pretty obvious. Production precedes consumption? Really? I thought I ate the sandwich before I baked it. Obviously. Well, it's not that obvious, and I'll use an illustration from, I think yesterday or the day before, online, and you probably don't know the guy, but he's a rather insignificant blogger. So this guy, anyway, just to give you a little background, he blogs for the New York Times website. Sometimes he shows up in the actual printed newspaper too, but he's not very important. I think he used to be an economist, but that's not clear. Anyway, he commented on the lockdown, saying that, well, the lockdown was annoying but sustainable. No big deal, right? So he says, well, many workers and some businesses were receiving enough in emergency aid to avoid hardship. And we could have plugged the holes in that safety net, that is more money to people, right? Making lockdown tolerable much longer. Well, that means he misunderstands the whole production precedes consumption thing, right? So I just called him out on it. So I said that, well, obviously this guy is a little loony. And I said, well, I needed to explain myself because it's not always obvious on Twitter. I said, well, for those of you who don't see it, Krugman completely misses the problem of production. You can't eat money. Sending people checks will not feed them, right? And you cannot buy what isn't being produced. Krugman completely overlooks this fact. That, oh, everybody just stay at home and then we'll give you money and you can just buy whatever you like. Well, if no one is producing stuff, what the heck are you gonna buy? Right? So I said, production precedes consumption. I haven't heard from him, but I'm guessing that when he saw that, he was like, darn it, I didn't think of that. But we'll see. Okay, so for us then, the main issue for business, which happens to be the same as in practice, is to produce goods that facilitate consumers' consumption, right? Because through consumption, we satisfy wants, and thereby we become better off. The whole point of production is to get something that is consumable, right? And for the business itself, the point is to make a profit out of facilitating value for consumers. So it's very indirect in a sense, right? That I'm putting all my own resources or my borrowed resources at risk, producing something for someone else, hoping that this will indeed create enough purchasing power for me so that I can buy stuff and satisfy my own wants. Very indirect, but that's how the economy works, right? And then we facilitate this through exchange and through trade by having different wants and also producing different things. So what does this mean then? Well, in terms of entrepreneurial production, we've been there all along, right? So this is from Menger, 1871, is a magnum opus. While economics textbooks do not, as you heard from Dr. Klein yesterday, economics textbooks do not include the word entrepreneur. Well, here we have Menger, the founder, talking about, oh yeah, by the way, this is the entrepreneurial process. This is what entrepreneurs and businessmen do. And he specified it, right? So he said that, well, first of all, they started by collecting information about the state of the world and the state of the economy and what do things look like. Then they engaged in economic calculation, his words, right? And trying to figure out, is there sort of a profit opportunity here? Can I use these resources in a better way to satisfy consumers by producing this other good? Or maybe it's the same good as others are producing, I don't know. But in any case, I'm going to fill some kind of gap for consumers, make them better off. Right? Then there's the act of will, just bringing it about, starting the damn business, putting those resources in place, hiring people, starting the production process, making sure that it runs smoothly enough, and then start sales, right? And of course, I have to supervise the execution of this process too. It's not enough to just step in and say, oh yeah, those resources here, resource 1, resource 2, resource 3, and just put them together, right? And then that's a good. That's not enough. There's a production process that is very practical and that we need to probably tweak, and we probably need to pivot a bunch of times before we actually find a good way of selling this thing or a good thing to sell. I mean, most entrepreneurs do not end up selling what they thought they were going to sell. They pivot a bunch of times. Okay, so when we talk about entrepreneurial production, we talk about first the imagination of something, because it doesn't exist yet, right? We're producing something new in some sense. Exactly in what sense? Doesn't really matter. Does it have to be super new? No, it doesn't. It might just be taking a good that is being offered somewhere else and offering it in a new place where it's not been offered before. It could be as simple as starting this is going to sound really innovative, but a new dry cleaning place, right? But in a town where there was none before. That's entrepreneurial too, right? Because you're providing something new to consumers. They don't have to travel 15 miles to do their laundry and stuff like that, right? But you have to imagine this new way of doing something, this new way of satisfying consumers. That's what you have to do as an entrepreneur, right? It's also always a speculative investment. And it's speculative, of course, because you can lose your money, but it's also speculative of what consumers might actually want. That's not obvious. And very often we think of entrepreneurship theory and so forth in terms of just figuring out what it is that people want. And of course, we do teach people that they should survey their customers. Say, well, how much would you pay for this? And would you pay for this? And how much is this worth? And would it be better if it's pink? Those things. Well, what people say doesn't really matter all that much. Because when you actually offer something, their response might be completely different, right? And some people have realized this, and I have a couple of quotes here of people whom you might have heard of saying things to this effect, right? Henry Ford, who apparently did not say this, but it's a good quote anyway. He said, if I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. So he had to imagine a new type of good for consumers, right? Yeah, of course he could have surveyed people back in the early 1900s. Said, so what do you want me to do with all these resources? I can sort of do wheels and carriages and stuff. Well, what would you prefer? Well, they would have said, I already have a carriage, but how about a faster horse? Well, I have no idea how to breed faster horses. And probably the same for Ford. So he said, well, I think it's better with a carriage without a horse. Because because that would be more reliable and that would be cooler and you can get it in all types of colors as long as they're black, all these things, right? So he imagined that people would be better off with a carriage without a horse, whereas people were focused on the horse. And we know that people's imagination about what they want or what they imagine they will have in the future, it's always sort of what they have, but a little different. They're not actually taking a step forward much. So if you read comic books from the 50s, how did they perceive the future? Well, they would still have the huge Cadillacs, but they were flying and stuff like that. Well, it's basically taking what they had and said, well, maybe in the air. Okay. Well, that's not actually what happened, right? Cars look very different today, and they don't fly. Not yet, anyway. Okay, and the same with Steve Jobs. Basically saying that screw customers. They don't know what they want. But often what you have to do is show them something, and then they go, whoa, right? Which tells you something about the message that you actually have to communicate to them, that you're providing them with something good and potentially valuable to them. So you have to, as an innovative entrepreneur, you actually have to educate your customers, making it pretty damn hard. And also, it also means that you really have to know people in order to do this right. Okay, and then we have the Krugman point. Production takes time. So that's why we have to be imaginative and think about what things would be like in the future, because no matter what we produce, we will not instantaneously have things to offer, right? And even if we would have those things to offer, we would still need to seek out the customer and make sure that the customer shows up or whatever it is. Okay? And because things take time, the whole market will have changed in different ways. So someone else might have the same idea as I do, which happens to a lot of entrepreneurs, right? So when I'm teaching an entrepreneurship course, students always have ideas for new products. Well, always, and I mean always. This is something that other entrepreneurs have already been at for a year or two trying to realize, because they're thinking in the flying Cadillac kind of thing, that type of thinking. They're taking one step, whereas as the entrepreneur, in order to bring it about, to make it happen, you need to take it at least 2 steps forward, right? So, and of course, people's views might change as well. And people's views change, their valuations change depending on what others are offering. If you remember the blue figure before, if someone else has offered different goods that were never offered before, what they're actually going to want and rank those different ones is going to be very different. Okay, and then, of course, economic calculation. We rely on market prices that are formed by entrepreneurs bidding for resources based off of the price they think they will be able to charge, right? So any individual entrepreneur will calculate, based off of what they believe they will be able to charge and what the prices are, but entrepreneurship, the function, has made those prices happen through bidding for those resources, right? Based off of the prices they think they will be able to charge. But this does not really hold within the firm, though, right? So within the firm, it's different. And this is how Rothbard illustrates the firm. And he says that because the firm integrates more than one stage of production, you're sort of blind to whether either stage or any stage is actually efficient, because you don't have prices between those stages within the firm. And that's one way of putting it, right? But the firm is the entrepreneur's creation. You create it for a reason, right? So it's not simply a mirror image of the market. That doesn't make any sense. Why would you go from having prices to not having prices? So you're obviously doing something different, or it wouldn't be a firm. Within the firm, the entrepreneur establishes sort of the boundaries and what the offering is supposed to be, and then you hire the manager. The manager tweaks what you're already doing, making sure to cut away waste and become more effective in that production process. But the entrepreneur decides basically whether there should be a firm or not. That's the decision that the entrepreneur makes. Okay, and this is Mises talking about how the manager is really a junior partner of the entrepreneur from human action. And it doesn't really matter, he says, what the contract is with the manager. still a junior partner. It doesn't matter which manager either. They're all hired in the firm. Okay, so the way I think of it is seeing the firm as an island of specialization where you create those new stages of production. And we'll get into this again on Thursday, and I'll explain what this means. But within the firm, you're attempting something that is not doable in the market. If it was doable, then why wouldn't you just rely on market prices instead? That way you would be efficient, sort of automatically. So why would you take it inside the firm instead and be blind to whether you're efficient? Makes no sense at all. So you're doing something beyond what the market can coordinate in one form or another. And I elaborate on this in this one of my 2 books, and it's available downstairs and in the online store as well. And I think the price is actually a whole lot lower in the Mises store than anywhere else. So, well, depending on how much you want to pay, you can either visit the store or buy it somewhere else. Okay, so what is going on here? Let's then move from theory to practice. Well, we've already taken a few steps, but let's get a little closer. Well, in terms of the theories out there, economists are, I'm being nice calling them semi-useless. But mainstream economics is really not useful at all. Even managerial economics is pretty useless. Because equilibrium simply does not apply, right? And most entrepreneurs fail most of the time. That's the truth, right? So there are not a whole lot of businesses that survive many years. And why is that? Well, my explanation is that it's because they're not Austrians. And I'm not kidding. We'll get back to that. Okay? Successful businesses are really in the business of creating our futures, right? So yes, production takes time. They have correctly imagined how they can provide value to consumers. And so much value that consumers are more than willing to pay the price that they're charging, right? So any business, it doesn't matter if it's existing, if it's big or small, if it's a new one, they always have to pursue consumer satisfaction. That has to be the goal. Or, well, there is no or. That has to be the goal. Okay, so experienced entrepreneurs, I've noticed, when you talk to people who have started a bunch of firms, who have experience of both failing and succeeding and so forth, they're Austrians. They just don't know it, okay? So they develop this gut feeling or sort of an intuition for how to run a business and whether this makes sense or not on behalf of consumers. Will this actually satisfy people's wants? That's the question we would ask, right? That's not the terms they would use. Well, they sort of have this intuitively through experience, but they don't have the theory that we have. They don't have the context. They don't have the terminology. So they just sort of know tacitly through their experience. Okay, so if we look then at the Austrian business, which I just defined as a successful business, then it begins and ends with the consumer. Because any production is just a means to an end, right? It's a means to the consumer's end. It's a means to satisfying consumers' wants. Of course, this means the consumer is sovereign, just like Mises put it in Human Action, right? You as an entrepreneur or as a businessman can only produce goods, make them available to the consumer, and then hope that they say, yay, and give you the money, right? Maybe they said yes for the 5 to 6 years it took you to develop a new model car. They said yes, 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 and they were like, ooh, ooh, ooh. Sounds really cool, and I'm gonna buy it, and then when you finally have it, and they go, nah. They're in the right to do that, right? And that's your problem. They're making it your problem, even though it's simply because you listened too much to what they were saying, right? And you have to focus, as an Austrian businessman, on the entire experience. It's not the case that we're selling products. We're not selling services. We're selling a complete experience to consumers. This includes the advertising, maybe creating a warm, fuzzy feeling in their hearts or whatever it is, or information about how to use something. It includes the pricing of the good. It includes the different colors, the different shapes, where it's located. It includes absolutely everything, right? So you can produce different business models in different firms where you offer different levels of service, right? So some businesses have terrible service, but they're cheap. Other businesses offer exactly the same thing, but much better customer service. Two completely different products, two completely different experiences, and different consumers will choose different products, right? So the selling price is super important. It's part of the product. So the way to price a product is to first, and the way to start a business overall, is to first imagine that, oh, this is a want that I can satisfy for people. This is going to be super valuable to people, using the blue illustration from before, right? So this is going to be so valuable that they're willing to pay a price. They're more than willing to pay a price. They will consider it a great deal to pay a price this high because their value is this high, right? So this is subjective, this is objective in dollars. Doesn't matter because they will subjectively value both of these, right? The dollars they give up for the product, they will look at, well, what else can I get for those dollars? And they will see your product and they will go, I'm just gonna buy it. I'm not even gonna think about it because this is a great deal for me, right? So that's where you start. The price is really defined by the consumer, by the consumer's willingness to pay for this product and eagerness to pay for it even, right? Your job as an entrepreneur is really to choose the cost. That's what you do. You imagine how to satisfy consumers, then you choose the costs given the price. So you imagine the good, you guess or guesstimate the price that you will be able to charge, and then you choose the cost structure so that you can get something in between. And if you're wrong, then the cost will probably be higher than the price that you can charge. Okay? This is, of course, this last point that you see with the strike-through. That's a pet peeve of mine. So if any of you would, God forbid, get an MBA, that's a crappy education. They will teach you that the way to do it in big businesses is to price goods as cost plus. So they will do exactly the anti-Austrian thing and the anti-market thing. They will say, we should have a new detergent with strawberry flavor or something. Right? So we'll sell that. How much does it cost us to produce this thing? Okay, well, we require 15% profit margin, so we'll take the cost, add the 15%, and that's the price. We'll see what's wrong here? This has nothing to do with consumer wants. So you're losing out no matter what, right? Because either that price that you calculated based off of cost is too high, meaning you will not sell enough to cover your costs, or it's too low, meaning you're just leaving money on the table. Because consumers would be willing to pay a much higher price for the same good because you're satisfying a real want. Right? It doesn't matter which way it goes, you're still losing. So it's crazy. Cost plus method, that's just stupid. Okay, so also, what you should do as a businessman is to prefer prices. It sounds a little weird, but what I mean by that is that you should focus on your core value facilitation in the business. So why have your own sort of accounting department or IT department or whatever it might be in the business if you don't have to? The entrepreneur should leave as many things as possible to the market, because that means that you're paying market prices for those things. So you can, first of all, focus more on where you're actually contributing value, and you can calculate much more easily whether you are doing it efficiently and effectively because the market has set the price for this service. Right? If you integrate everything in your business, you're just blind. Right? It's better to focus on where you're actually providing value. So outsource as much as possible. Don't outsource when it's costlier, of course, but make sure that it actually contributes value. Very often, I think managers especially, and some entrepreneurs, they integrate things because they want to be a little central planner, right? Small scale central planner. And they want to be in control of things. Well, you're not more in control of things because an employee is doing it sitting in your office than if you have a contract with a business firm specializing in that service. That's an illusion. And you should use the market pricing mechanism whenever you can, because you're better off, it's easier for you to actually provide value, and you're actually contributing to the economic system's efficiency as well. Okay? So the main task of the entrepreneur is to imagine how to satisfy consumers and reimagine how to satisfy consumers, because it might be the case that you think things will change. Well, then you don't stay the course. Then you pivot. You change what you're doing. Maybe you just pull the plug on your business, whatever it is. And you choose the lowest cost. So often when we're talking about, say, the next iPhone or whatever, people take it apart and they look at the components and they calculate what the cost is and what the profit is. Well, that's exactly the wrong thing to do, right? What they should do in Apple is not simply take all those things and then, let's see here. But rather, if I produce a good like this that you can use for these purposes and satisfy these wants, they will be more than willing to pay. How much is an iPhone? 35,000 or something? They would be willing to pay this for an iPhone, and then that allows me to put all these materials in there, make it seem much more luxurious or whatever. Right? And then I can have this more memory and this other services in there just to bring this experience to the customer. Right? That's the way to think about it. Okay, so you choose your costs, you choose how you produce it, you choose everything else based off of the price that you believe that you will be able to charge. Okay, so what does this mean then in the business? Well, it means that the entrepreneur really answers one question. How can I best serve consumers? This should not be a super surprise for you guys, but it is a surprise for non-Austrians. And this is something that all entrepreneurs with experience, they know. They know that the consumer is sovereign, the consumer is king. Right? So they will not attempt to push something onto consumers that they might not like. They will instead adapt to what consumers like more, because that's the higher value, that means the higher price, that means it's easier to cover costs. Right? And for management, you really have two questions. First, how can we strengthen our value proposition? And the value proposition is the offering, right? That's the good that we're offering, the whole experience. Note the word strengthen. I'm not saying change. That's the entrepreneur who does that, right? The manager asks, how can we strengthen it given what the entrepreneur, that function, has already imagined or figured out is the actual contribution. The manager takes what has been put in place and figures out better ways of doing it. And how can we operate more effectively? How can we get more output for these inputs? Can we tweak the production process, perhaps? Can we put people in different places? Can we use different types of shifts? Can we use different types of human resources? Can we use maybe a different type of machine, different location? Any tweaks to the production process? But you're not changing whether you're doing that type of business, or maybe we should have a different type of product. Well, that's the entrepreneur's realm, right? The entrepreneur is bearing that uncertainty. Okay, so that's not supposed to be there. Finally then, there's a lot to be done in applying Austrian economics to business practice. And it's a lot of really matchmaking between the experiences that businessmen and women have and the theory that we have. And we haven't really gone into this a whole lot in Austrian economics. So we don't have the tools, the sort of models that we can offer to business people, but we can develop them, and that's part of what we're doing. And one of those projects that the Mises Institute is involved in is Economics for Business. It's an initiative that we're running. Part of this is the Economics for Entrepreneurs podcast, with, which has over 70 episodes so far. And I think the standard rule is that every other episode is sort of an Austrian theory applied to business, and every other is a practitioner, a real entrepreneur, who's talking about how it applied to their experiences. Okay, there's more. We recently published an ebook on Austrian economics in business, or Austrian business, or whatever you want to call it, which is available for free at mises.org/E4B_ebook. And it has chapters by prominent Austrians, such as Dr. Klein, Dr. McCaffrey, Vishal Gupta, Mark Packard, and others who have featured in the podcast as well. And of course, there's a forthcoming special issue of the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics on entrepreneurship, trying to bring not only Austrian theory and practice together, but also entrepreneurship theory, mainstream entrepreneurship theory. So those three, putting those together in one issue, seeing what are the gains from trade, basically, between these three. So there's a lot to be done here, but we already know a lot. And we can, which is a very good grade, in a sense, for Austrian economics, we can apply what we already know and just expand it a little bit, because we're right. It does apply, and practitioners know it. All right? Thank you.
Extra points in my class. Anton, give him a round of applause.
No, he was holding off just for the applause. See, dude. Yeah, and the rational choice. Although I was gonna say, I love my moment where it's a whiteboard goes. I didn't even know. Oh, don't you worry. It's on the line. You can see me run. Well, I'm sure I'm not. Never turn around.
Okay, let's get started. First off, an announcement. After this lecture, we're supposed to meet in the conservatory for our group photo. I'm not exactly sure where the photo is going to be taken, but I have been told that we're supposed to meet there, and then we'll be told where to go for the group photo. So this lecture is on the Austrian theory of the business cycle, and it's sort of an interesting step that we're taking in the course of the week, because we're taking a step into the hampered market economy. So when we talk about the Austrian theory of the business cycle, we're referring to something that doesn't happen in an unhampered market economy, or at least it's not supposed to. So something outside of the market economy is acting that causes the boom-bust cycle to occur in the Austrian theory. So let's just quickly recap what we've learned about the unhampered market economy so that we can better contrast what happens in the business cycle. So we've seen, probably the best example is with Crusoe. We've seen how Crusoe, alone on his island, he can economize. He sees the resources around him, and he can allocate them towards productive uses based on his preferences and based on his ideas about how those resources can be combined in such a way to achieve the ends that he has. And if he wants so-called economic growth, if he wants an increase in his standard of living, more consumption goods, then what he needs to do is he needs to set aside consumption goods. So suppose he has coconuts and berries. He needs to set aside a certain stock of coconuts and berries to last him through the period of production where he would need to create some capital goods that would then allow him to create more consumption goods. So he might be in some state. In order for him to increase his wealth, he has to save first. He has to set aside real resources that he doesn't consume immediately. He sets them aside for a different purpose. And that purpose is to either sustain him through the production process or to accumulate productive resources, factors of production that help him make the things that he needs to make more things that he wants. And so we have a theory of sustainable economic growth for Crusoe that way. And it's not really much of a problem. I mean, it would be sort of difficult for Crusoe surviving by himself, but intellectually it's not a problem because there's only one mind. There's only one person making these choices, so he can evaluate everything that's around him and make these choices on his own. It's his ideas about how to combine factors of production. It's his preferences that he's trying to attain, his satisfactions that he's trying to, get towards. So there's not really a problem. It's a little bit more of a problem when we have more than one person in an economy. It's a little bit more difficult because now we have two people with preferences, two people with ideas, or more than two people, and we have to come up with a way to allocate factors of production, allocate savings in such a way as to still economize. We still want to achieve our most highly valued ends. We want to get the most important stuff and forego the less important stuff, given our set of resources and the ideas that we have. And we've seen through the past 2 days lectures on the mechanics of the unhampered market economy, how that happens. So we have market prices. Entrepreneurs can engage in economic calculation. So this is how we know that resources are going to their highest valued use. So we're going to see a breakdown of that. This is just one example of a breakdown of that system. And it's called the Austrian business cycle theory. So Crusoe's one example. Before I even get into any of the slides, perhaps a good analogy for the business cycle with Crusoe is that suppose one morning Crusoe wakes up and he sees some colorful mushrooms outside of his den. And he partakes some of these mushrooms, and then later on in the day, his eyes get big and changing colors, and he starts hallucinating. And he looks at his stockpile of coconuts and berries that he's been working on, and he hallucinates that it's just 100 times bigger than it actually is. He thinks he has way more saved resources than he actually has, and it's just the effect of these mushrooms, perhaps. So you might see how Crusoe, seeing this much larger set of saved resources, would now undertake different production processes. He would undertake longer production processes. He might build different capital goods, more specific capital goods, because he thinks he has a larger supply of saved resources than he actually has. So, someday the effect of the mushrooms wear off and he realizes that he's made all of these mistakes in the past. He dedicated factors of production, or he created factors of production that aren't for lines of production that can't be completed. So he changed his plans based on this incorrect view of his saved resources, and he's realized that he's made a mistake and he's gonna have to do something about it. Now what should he do? Should he consume more mushrooms? Just pretend that there's not a problem? So that's at least one solution. That seems like a bad one, right? What he should do is he should, make do with what he has. So he's gonna have to convert some of the specific capital goods that he created in that process for other purposes, for a shorter period of production, for different lines than what he had designed in his, in his high, while he was hallucinating. Probably a more straightforward analogy comes from Mises with the master builder. So let's go through this. So Mises says in Human Action, the whole entrepreneurial class is, as it were, in the position of the master builder whose task it is to erect a building out of a limited supply of building materials. If this man overestimates the quantity of the available supply, he drafts a plan for the execution of which the means at his disposal are not sufficient. He oversizes the groundwork and the foundations and only discovers later in the progress of the construction that he lacks the material needed for the completion of the structure. It is obvious that our master builder's fault was not an overinvestment, but an inappropriate employment of the means at his disposal. So this is a great analogy because it works in a metaphorical sense. So we see in a business cycle, the class of entrepreneurs, they all make a similar kind of error. They all make errors at the same time, what Rothbard referred to as the cluster of errors. And so it works in a metaphorical sense, applying this to the business cycle, but it also works in a literal sense because we can actually see in some boom bust cycles, we we many new construction projects undertaken where people are building new houses. And we literally run into the problem where we don't have enough materials to complete the projects that we've started. So this is Mises's analogy. All right, so now let's get into the meat here. Let's get towards a definition of a business cycle. Definitions are good because they help us exclude other things that aren't the thing that we're trying to define. The Austrians are particularly good at doing that. So let's rule out some things. Let's try to figure out what are some things that we might initially look at and say that's a business cycle, but it's actually not. So one example that business cycles are not is just typical business fluctuations. So we see in the workings of the market economy changes happening all the time. Production changes, maybe due to a change in the level of natural resources, maybe to a change in technology that we can dream up. Consumption changes, people change their preferences for consumption goods all of the time. And so there's just change all throughout the market economy happening all the time. And this does not pose a particular problem. We've seen how it's the entrepreneur who is tasked with anticipating these changes, bearing the uncertainty of the market, bearing the uncertainty of all of these changes happening, and then profit or loss results. And since they're aiming towards profit, we would hope that they're arranging production in such a way that we do have consumer preferences being satisfied. So that's the entrepreneur's task, is to satisfy consumer demands. So that's not what we mean by a business cycle. It's not just a localized sort of change in a market. What we mean by business cycle is it's marked by a general boom and general bust. So it's not localized, it's not one particular change. It's what we see in economic data like the following. And really what matters is just that you see the shape of the line. It's not necessarily what we're looking at. But in the top left, it's the S&P 500. In the top right, it's the unemployment rate. In the bottom left, it's gross output. And in the bottom right, it's the Case-Shiller home index, home price index. So we see that there's this up and down, and it seems like things move up and then they move down for some sort of reason. We see wages go up and then they come down. We see capital goods prices increase and then they come down. Employment goes up and then it goes down. And so this is what we're trying to explain. Oh, by the way, also the coming down is sort of painful. It seems like, you know, entrepreneurs are earning lots of losses. And so that's another thing that we need to explain in our business cycle theory. Another feature of the business cycle that we need to explain is the fact that capital goods prices fluctuate more than consumer goods prices. And this is noted by Rothbard. Probably still the greatest exposition of Austrian business cycle theory is in Rothbard's America's Great Depression in the first few chapters. So he says capital goods industries fluctuate more widely than do the consumer goods industries. Okay, so let's do some stock taking. What does this theory need to take into account? It needs to take into account the shape or the stages of the cycle. So there's a boom, and you can actually see that in these graphs. On the left, there's the consumer price index, and on the right, it's the Fed zone. They probably don't measure it themselves, but they report it, the producer price index. So they're looking at the prices of capital goods. So there's the boom, there's an increase in price, there's an increase in capital values, there's an increase in firm values, and then a sharp decrease. It needs to take into account the cluster of entrepreneurial errors that are all happening at the same time. So what could possibly be an explanation for everybody making the same sorts of mistakes at the same time? It needs to take into account the difference in the fluctuations in prices in the consumer goods industries and the capital goods industries. And right off the bat, we can look at some suspect areas. So we can look at money, and the reason that might be a good place to look is because money is a part of all transactions. So money is called the widely accepted medium of exchange, and so everybody's doing transactions with money on one part of it. One side of every exchange is money. We can also look at credit, since it also pervades the economy. So we could look at those two areas as at least suspect areas where something might be going wrong, and we can see, you know, what's causing the boom and then the bust. Okay, so this is sort of a structure for the rest of the lecture. We need to cover these bases. We need to recap structure of production, which Professor Rittenauer expertly explained this morning. We need to recap time preference and interest. We can also do that quickly because of a great lecture by Professor Herbener. We need to look at sustainable growth, or the mechanics of sustainable growth. We'll look at an example that's a little bit more complicated than Crusoe just saving more. And then we'll contrast that with unsustainable growth. We'll contrast that with the case where it looks like there's an increase in production, it looks like there's economic growth that's happening, but it can't persist for some reason. And we'll get to that in the unsustainable growth part. And we'll see that the main culprits here, the key features of the boom period that cause it to turn into a bust, is the malinvestment and overconsumption that happens during the boom. And so we'll single those two key features out as we go. So first, structure of production. Instead of flourless chocolate cake, I'm going to look at a ham sandwich. This is an exercise that I go through with my students on the first day of class, and usually there's lots of back and forth, but for the sake of time, I'm going to do this sort of quickly. So what do we need to make a ham sandwich? You can imagine you need to or you want to purchase a ham sandwich from a deli. What are the sort of things that have to be there at the deli for you to enjoy the ham sandwich? And some of the things are very obvious. You need ham for a ham sandwich: bread, lettuce, tomato, mayo, a plate, a table and chair to enjoy the ham sandwich on. The actual deli takes up space, takes up physical space. And so we call that land, the physical space that the deli takes up. And you need somebody there to put the elements together. And that's it, right? That's all we need to explain for where a ham sandwich comes from. Yeah, somebody's shaking, there's one person shaking their head no. No, you're supposed to say no. We have to explain where all of these other things come from. And so the structure of production behind this particular consumer good, this ham sandwich, is actually much more complex. So the ham might come from a butcher, the bread from a bakery. Lettuce comes from farming, and so do tomatoes and the ingredients that go to mayonnaise. Who even knows what goes into mayonnaise? I guess there's eggs also go into mayonnaise, so we need a chicken farm. The paper mill helps us, or gives us materials to make paper plates. A furniture manufacturer makes the tables and chairs. Notice there are no further steps for land and labor, and the reason for that is because those are originary factors of production. So we don't need to explain anything beyond or where we get land and labor from. Those are just sort of given to us. We start off with those. The butcher requires land and labor, and a refrigerator and knives and all sorts of things. The bakery requires land and labor, an oven, flour, and this can just go on and on. At some point, we have big metal machines show up, and there's a chicken and the egg problem. So we need big metal machines to refine the metals that give us the metals to help us make the big metal machines. So who even knows how that happened? So the whole thing becomes really complicated, and if you really take it to its conclusion, you get something that looks like this. It's just this massively complex network of factors of production that are required to be combined in certain ways to get to the consumption good. If I look at my students' papers sometimes on the first day of class, sometimes it just looks like this. Like they just give up, and it's just becoming too complicated. Okay, so this is not particularly helpful. Well, it's helpful for us to at least see the complexity of production, but it's not helpful if we want to analyze what's going on here. And so one thing that the Austrian School has done is that they have taken this very complex structure of production and arranged it in a helpful pedagogical way. And the way that they've done that is with the structure of production, or the Hayekian triangle. You've seen it. Sometimes it's arranged vertically, where you go from higher order goods to lower order goods, the lowest order good being the consumption good. And so, man, this animation took a long time. I hope you appreciate it. So here's how we can take all of these features, all of these components of creating a ham sandwich, and put them in time order. Yeah. So we start with natural resources. We start with research and development at the very beginning of the stages of production. And then at the very end, we end up with the desired output, the ham sandwich. And we have the arrow indicates time, so time goes this way. So this is still a little bit cluttered, as you can see. And so what we can do is, since all of these elements in a market economy, all of these elements have market prices, we can tally up the expenditures on these factors of production in their various stages. And so that would look something like this. Well, first of all, this arrangement should look familiar to figure 32 from Rothbard's Man, Economy, and State. You have to turn your head sideways. Yeah, some people are doing that. But you could see the factors of production, land, labor, and capital are arranged in a way where we end up with a consumption good at the end. So here's where we stack up the spending in the various stages. So on the left-hand side, we have spending in the first stage of production, and then we end up with total consumption spending on the right-hand side. It's the same thing. We've arranged all of the stages of production by time, and we've also added up the spending on factors of production, the cost of production at each stage. And one thing that we know is that in the ERE, once we take away all uncertainty about the future, the only remaining spread between stages is just interest. So we're going to see, in fact, on the very next slide, we're going to see a loanable funds market, but this is really the more important aspect of the time market. It's the capital structure, where capitalists are parting with present consumption today. They're parting with present resources today so they can't consume. In hopes for, in the future, they want revenue from the sale of their output, which means that they're making an intertemporal exchange, which means that they have to reckon their time preferences in that process. And so the interest rate applies in the capital structure just as much as it does in the loanable funds market, which we'll see here. So all that to say, production is interest rate sensitive. So production and the length of the production process has to do with our intertemporal preferences, or time preferences. Okay, so let's take a closer look at time preference. So we prefer a given satisfaction sooner rather than later. However, there are different rates of time preference, which means that we can exchange. And in fact, you can put All the people who have present money available to be lent to others, you can put them on a supply curve. And all the people who want present money today and are willing to pay a future amount of money for the money that they get today, we can put them on the demand curve, including people who might borrow so that they can purchase factors of production and produce. So that's what happens in this loanable funds market as we build out Roger Garrison's graphical exposition of the Austrian business cycle theory. So here's just one example of a trade that can happen between two people who have different rates of time preference. So the present money goes from Jeff over to David. In exchange, David agrees to pay the future amount of $1,100 or a 10% interest rate over whatever the time period is. So if we have a bunch of people, then we can make a demand curve and a supply curve, and we see the equilibrium interest rate in this loanable funds market. We're going to take this loanable funds market and the amount of borrowing that happens, the total amount of transactions that happens between savers and borrowers, and we're going to allow that to correspond to the level of investment spending in a trade-off between investment spending and consumption spending. So in this top graph here, this might look familiar to you if you've seen a production possibilities frontier. It's not exactly a production possibilities frontier because that shows two different goods or two different factors of production that somebody might use to produce something. In this case, it's just a trade-off between consumption and investment. And this should make sense. So if we have a given set of resources, we can either use them for present consumption or future consumption. With a given set of resources, we can consume them today, or we can set them aside and use them for future production. And that can either look like, plain saving, where we just hold on to, some set of consumption goods that allow us to consume during a production process, or we actually have resources that are factors of production themselves that are productive. So that represents the investment side of things. So you can see how this lines up with the loanable funds market in the bottom, and all you have to say is that all of the funds that are used for investment are subject to time preference, and some of that money is trading hands in the market for loanable funds, and some of it is entrepreneurs who are lending to themselves, but they still need an interest return. And so either way, we can line up so that the total level of investment spending in this economy is the same as the quantity of loans that are transacted in the bottom graph, the loanable funds market. Okay, so here's just one quick example. What happens if we have an increase in savings? If we have an increase in savings or a decrease in the rate of time preference, people will increase their supply of saved funds. So the supply of loanable funds increases. We just move down the demand curve. We have a new lower interest rate in this market. We have an increase in the quantity of loans that are transacted. And we can see how that corresponds. We move across the consumption and investment trade-off. So now we're consuming less and investing more. So these tell the same story. We're just looking at it in different ways. So in the bottom graph, we said there's an increase in the supply of loanable funds. Before that, we said there was a decrease in the rate of time preference. That's synonymous with saying we're going to consume less today. We're going to decide to consume less today, and because we want to consume more in the future. So we do that sort of trade-off. The result of this is economic growth. We have more resources to consume and to invest in the future. So if we decide to dedicate more resources to production today, that means in the future we have additional resources. And so that real resource constraint, as depicted by the bowed outward curve there, it expands outward. And really the only assumption that we have to make there is that the additional investment that we've made is net investment. It's more than just what we need to replace or maintain our existing capital stock. So we have positive net investment. So we're adding to our capital stock, we're adding to our productive capabilities, we have economic growth. We have an increase in the amount of resources that we can use for both consumption and investment. Okay, so back to our starting point here. Let's add another component. Here we have our familiar Hayekian triangle. So before I just had the dollar signs stacked up on top of each other, but here's it's just sort of smoothed out here. It's the structure of production. So we start with land and labor, and we end up with consumption spending at the very end. So spending is depicted in the horizontal, in the vertical dimension, and then the stages of production, the length of production and time-wise is in the horizontal dimension. One thing that Roger Garrison liked to add to this diagrammatical exposition is stage-specific labor markets. And the reason for that is because he liked to compare this sort of setup to what Keynesians were saying about the macroeconomy. And they're very interested in saying what's happening to employment. So here we have a late-stage labor market and an early-stage labor market. So on the right-hand side, we might have a labor market for a retail store. So at Walmart, this could be the supply and demand for retail workers. Notice the price there is a lowercase w for wage, and the quantity is a uppercase L for quantity of laborers or number of labor hours. And same in the early-stage labor market, this might be for lumberjacks or miners. So labor that is in the earliest stages of production. So let's recap what we have here. We have in the top left a Hayekian triangle. It's our structure of production. In the top right, we have a trade-off between consumption and investment. And that black line shows our real resource constraint. In the bottom right, we have the loanable funds market, or a typical credit market. By the way, time markets are visible in two locations here. So in the bottom right, we have a loanable funds market. But the capital structure also at least gives you the gist of a time market for production. You remember the slope of the Hayekian triangle gives you the interest rate, because capitalists are also engaged in intertemporal exchange. And in the bottom left, we have some stage-specific labor markets. Okay, so let's do an example with all of these elements of sustainable growth. So what does it look like for this economy to lower their rate of time preference and increase savings? So the first step is to increase the supply of loanable funds. We see that this results in a lower equilibrium interest rate, an increase in the funds available and also that are transacted, because we move down this demand curve. More people are willing to borrow at this lower interest rate. They're happy to borrow these additional saved funds. This corresponds to a lower level of consumption and increased investment in the top right in the trade-off. Our Hayekian triangle, our structure of production, makes this sort of shift. So it gets shorter because we have less consumption going on, but it gets longer. And the explanation here is that you'll notice that the interest rate fell. So, and the slope of the Hayekian triangle is the interest rate. So what entrepreneurs in effect are doing is they see these additional saved funds and they're responding appropriately. They're responding in such a way as to say, okay, consumers, you have lowered your rate of time preference. You don't want as much consumption goods now. You're waiting on more consumption goods in the future. So you decreased your rate of time preference, fine. We'll start new lines of production that are longer. We'll make new capital goods. We'll make new specific capital goods and make things that won't come to completion until later. And that's exactly what consumers have said when they've increased their savings in the loanable funds market. So it matches up quite well. What does this mean for the demand for labor in early and late stages? Well, there's an increase in demand for labor in the early stages and a decrease in demand for labor in the late stages. And this is simply because the discounted marginal revenue product of the workers in these different stages has changed. So the discount that you would apply to the workers in these different stages has decreased. And so now there's increased demand as you go further back in time to the earlier stage workers. So we see this sort of change, an increase in the wage rates for early stage workers and a decrease for the late stage workers. So everything corresponds with what consumers want. Consumers have said we're going to increase our savings, we're not going to consume as much, and entrepreneurs have responded likewise. They said, okay, we'll start new production projects that take longer. And we've already seen the long run results of this. As we increase productivity, if we have more capital goods, if we've expanded our capital stock, We've engaged in new, longer lines of production, and those new, longer lines of production were undertaken because the entrepreneurs foresee this increased consumption in the future. So consumers have said that they want that. So there's an expanded set of resources, and also the structure of production can expand as well. So this, if you remember, a long time ago, I talked about Crusoe. This is what happens at Crusoe. He said, not the mushroom example though, I'm going to set aside more consumption goods. I'm going to set aside more coconuts and berries today so that I can pursue a longer production process and produce more capital goods that help me produce more coconuts and berries, for example. And that additional productivity that he has by producing the capital goods allows him, at least it makes it easier for him to produce even more capital goods. So creating more capital goods makes it easier to make more capital goods. And that's what we see here. We've expanded our set of resources. In the top right diagram, we see the real resource constraint is nicer, it's easier. We have more resources to consume and invest. And also the structure of production has expanded. Okay, so let's summarize this in a qualitative way as opposed to a graphical way. So saving involves freeing up resources for production. In credit markets, saved funds are made available to entrepreneurs to purchase factors of production. Entrepreneurs take those funds, the new longer lines of production are started, which is in line with consumers' time preferences. The additional investment in excess of what is required for the maintaining or replacing of the capital stock pays off with an expanded set of resources in the future. Said another way, this economy experiences sustainable economic growth. So there's nothing here that says that this economy is going to have to contract. There's nothing here that is unsustainable. And if anything, this economic growth paves the way for even more economic growth, sustainable economic growth, because this economy now has more capital goods. Okay, so that's how things can work right. Here, let's now change things up. And let's suppose that there's an increase in the supply of loanable funds that does not originate with a change in consumers' time preferences. So what if we have just this brand new source of funds that does not come from people saying, I'm going to forego consumption today. I'm going to forego present consumption so that I could have future consumption. In fact, let's keep people's time preferences the same so that we can isolate the effect of this sort of artificial increase in loanable funds. All right, so just a reminder from yesterday when we talked about banking, you'll remember that in both fractional reserve banking without a central bank and in fractional reserve banking with a central bank, it's possible for there to be increases in the supply of credit that don't originate from people saying, I'm going to increase my saving. So we can have an increase in saving that does not, we can have an increase in the supply of credit that does not come from people saying, I'm going to relinquish the ability to consume present resources today. And the reason that works is because fractional reserve banks, they take people's deposits and they use that to issue new loans. So the loans are not coming from savings, they're coming from people's deposits that people have said that they want to be able to redeem at par on demand. So they haven't said that I'm going to relinquish present consumption. If anything, they've said, I want to be able to spend this money over the foreseeable future. And we've also seen the example where the central bank decides to purchase government bonds, and this expands the level of reserves in the fractional reserve banking system, which also serves as a basis for an increase in the supply of loans in the economy, notably without a change in time preference, without a change in people saying, I'm going to save more. Okay, so the central bank and or the fractional reserve banking system can expand credit without an economy-wide increase in real saving. Said another way, an economy-wide decrease in the rate of time preference. This newly created money enters the economy through credit markets, and so they represent an increase in the supply of loanable funds. Despite the fact that people have not decided to increase their saving, there is an increase in the supply of loanable funds. There are new green pieces of paper or ones and zeros in a bank account that look like saved funds, but it's not real savings. The interest rate falls, but not because of a decrease in the rate of time preference. At the lower interest rate, saving actually decreases, and we'll see that in the graphs in just a moment. Consumption and borrowing increase. Firms take the new funds and invest in new, longer lines of production because they can't necessarily tell the difference. So they see this increased availability of saved funds. It looks like the new, longer lines of production will be profitable. It looks the same from the entrepreneur's perspective. It looks the same as the case where consumers decided to withhold from consuming today. So factor prices are bid up across the board. Wages increase, employment increases, consumption increases, investment spending increases, and it's just great. It's wonderful. All the numbers are up, stock prices are up, stock indices are up, wages are up. It's a happy party. So we had this boom. So the reason this can't last, the reason this is an explanation for unsustainable growth is because we didn't actually increase the set of available resources. There was an increase in the amount of money, but there was not new wealth created. There was an increase in the supply of credit, but that didn't correspond with people's willingness to not consume today. And in fact, people, because of the decrease in the interest rate, people might consume more. In fact, they do consume more. It's called overconsumption. So consumers did not show that they preferred future output to present output. In fact, they decreased saving at the lower interest rate. The credit expansion does not represent an increase in real resources available for consumption or investment. And the results here are factors of production become increasingly scarce. The analogy that I like to use here is it's like a hungry hippos game for capital goods. So there's only like this fixed set of capital goods, and entrepreneurs are, they start tapping on the lever even faster because it looks like new, longer lines of production are profitable. So prices are bid up for those capital goods, and they're bid up higher than entrepreneurs expected, which means that the cost of production increase. If it was unexpected, if that increase in cost was unexpected, then they would not have pursued those new, longer lines of production. And so losses ensue. Those profits that they anticipated turn into losses, and projects are abandoned as a result. And this was actually a very prominent feature of the most recent completed boom-bust cycle that we saw. We saw plenty of new housing developments that were totally abandoned, halfway finished houses, halfway finished neighborhoods that they didn't get finished for a long time. So entrepreneurs were led to believe consumers had saved, and real resources were available for production. They also were led to believe that longer, more capital-intensive production would be profitable. Okay, so let's look at we have time. Let's see what this looks like with Roger Garrison's graphs. So in the bottom right, we have the loanable funds market. There's going to be an increase in the supply of loanable funds, but this increase in the supply of loanable funds is not because of an increase in real savings. It's just the new money that has entered the economy through credit markets. So through the fractional reserve banking system, there's this increase in the supply of loanable funds, but that dotted supply curve there is actually still in effect in the form of people's time preferences. And we see this as sort of a bifurcation. We see 2 points now. So since that existing supply curve represents consumers' time preferences, that shows what they're going to do. So at this new lower interest rate, they're going to decrease the quantity of loans that they supply on this market. They're going to increase their consumption and save less. And that's what the dot that goes down and to the left signifies. The new equilibrium point that's down and to the right signifies the new funds that perhaps businesses and some consumers are taking because of this increased availability of funds. So they are taking the new funds, but savers are actually saving less, which sounds backwards. The difference is made up by the new paper, the new money in this economy. Okay, so what does that mean for this trade-off? This is sort of an interesting thing. So the black line, as I said, represents the real resource constraint. So we can only consume and invest a certain amount, but we have an increase in consumption and an increase in investment. So what gives? How do we depict this in this two-dimensional graph here where so many things are happening? So the way Roger Garrison depicts it, and I don't know if he fully explained this when he would give this lecture, is he would show a point that's beyond the PPF. And so some people are like, wait, you can't do that because it's a production possibilities front. It's a trade-off. If you could go beyond it, then where should you actually draw that boundary? It's not really a boundary if you can put a point beyond it. My response is there's a difference in the real and nominal values now. The new money in the economy means that we can increase spending beyond what our real resource constraint would otherwise give us. So we can increase consumption spending and increase investment spending, even though our real resource constraint is what it is. The numbers don't line up with the real resources at this point. So we have this sort of like virtual, unachievable point beyond where we're spending that much, but it's beyond, we're consuming and investing beyond our real resource constraint, as we'll see. Okay, so what does this mean for the Hayekian triangle? For the structure of production, this also goes in two different directions. So you sort of see the discoordination here. So you see on the consumption and retail end of things, the triangle gets steeper and taller. So there's an increase in consumption. But entrepreneurs are also taking these new funds and they are pursuing new, longer lines of production. So there's this lengthening of the structure of production at the same time. And you'll notice that what's not getting attention is the middle of the structure of production. So, and that's the point where entrepreneurs will realize that they've made mistakes, perhaps. So there's the structure of production is really going in two different directions. We've got consumers pulling it one direction and producers pulling it in the other direction. But like I said, it's a party, so wages are up and everybody's happy. So on both the retail end and also the lumberjacks and miners, they've got an increase in their pay. So there's an increase in wages across the board. And this sort of shows us what's happening in factor markets in general. So capital goods prices are increasing. As consumers are making retail shops more profitable, the entrepreneurs who are taking these newly available funds, they're also increasing the wages and prices that they pay for factors of production. So incomes across the board are increasing. However, it can't last. And the reason it can't last is because we didn't actually have a real restructuring of the structure of production, or at least we didn't have a restructuring of the structure of production that was in line with people's time preferences. What we had was Crusoe hallucinated, and he thought he had this available set of resources, but it was false. So on all of the lines of production that entrepreneurs pursued, all these new longer lines, they'll turn out to be unprofitable. So the capital goods don't actually exist. They thought that there would be capital goods available for them to complete these projects, but there's an increasing scarcity. They'll realize that the resources that they need to complete their projects aren't actually there. And so that means that those prices will increase. Consumers are the ones who have final say over where real resources are going now. And so there was actually consumption of our total set of resources in the economy. Consumption increased. Saving decreased, real saving decreased. So that we might have actually eaten into our capital stock as opposed to bolstered it or increased it. So the economy shrinks, we have our bust. So what does the bust look like? Firms attempt to liquidate the malinvested capital. So they made all these mistakes, they're gonna have to fix the mistakes. They're gonna have to liquidate. They're going to have to, fetch or get the best price that they can for the capital goods that they invested in. Wages decrease and workers are laid off. So we see a decrease in demand for workers across the board. Credit markets dry up. So as consumers impose their real time preferences, it becomes more difficult to get loans. Credit markets dry up. Prices readjust to reflect consumer demands, it's a very good thing. So that's what we needed all along. So we made mistakes during the boom phase where we were allowing factor prices especially to not reflect consumer demands. So the bust is a recovery phase as people try to find profitable uses for land, labor, and capital. So we made the wrong sorts of capital goods. We pursued the wrong lines of production. We pursued lines of production that were longer than what consumers actually wanted. And the real resources for those new lines of production didn't actually exist. So everything comes to a halt, and we have to make do with what we actually have. just like Crusoe. Once he realizes his actual set of resources, he has to make do with what he actually has and make changes that way. So what are the lessons learned? If you just look at the highly aggregated data, so if you just look at the data that you can find at the Federal Reserve Economic Data website, then you're not going to see the real problem. You're not going to see the changes in the structure of production. So the errors were in the structure of production. The errors were malinvestment. We produced the wrong capital goods. But if you're looking at total investment spending, or really just total spending in the economy, you're not going to see that problem. You're going to misdiagnose the problem, and you're also probably going to give bad solutions. If you misdiagnose the problem and you see that, oh, all of a sudden there's this big decrease in spending, the solution is more spending, right? That's the sort of problems that arise when you just look at highly aggregated data. Another lesson that we've learned is that to properly analyze a hampered market economy, you have to at least have a good understanding of how the unhampered market economy functions. So we looked at an example of sustainable economic growth before we looked at the unsustainable, and that way we were able to contrast the two. And this goes back to a maxim by Hayek where he said, before we can meaningfully ask what might go wrong, we should first understand how things could ever go right. Finally, we saw how sustainable production, sustainable economic growth is based on a real reallocation of resources away from consumption. So we have to have real savings first. That's the prescription. That's what we really need to have sustainable economic growth. And we saw how unsustainable booms are caused by artificial increases in credit. So where we confuse entrepreneurs about the real availability of resources. We also saw how recessions are the time when we fix the mistakes of the past. So a lot of policies are directed at quelling the recession. They're about, like not making the recession so bad, or like just trying to increase spending during the recession. And all of these government interventions that are instituted during the recession phase actually work to our detriment. They actually make it more difficult for us to find the profitable uses of factors of production in our very complex capital structure. So I've run out of time. Once again, I've got a recommended reading slide. You can snap a picture. Our photo is up next. Thank you.